In the most dangerous stretch of water on the face of the earth, the breaking point that the entire world prayed would never come has finally arrived. The Strait of Hormuz, the singular fragile jugular vein of the global economy, has been pushed to the absolute brink. And in response, the United States of America has unleashed something utterly massive to force this strategic choke point wide open. Two lethal, state-of-the-art guided missile destroyers, the USS Frank E. Peterson Jr. and the USS Michael Murphy, have just carved their way through the treacherous waters of Hormuz. But make no mistake, these staggering leviathans of American steel are just the tip of the spear. Following right in the roaring wake of these naval titans comes a swarm of highly classified, high-tech underwater drones. The United States Central Command has officially ripped the Band-Aid off the crisis, announcing the launch of a massive, unprecedented mine-clearing operation. But this transit was anything but a quiet, routine patrol. It was a high-stakes game of nuclear chicken played out on the open ocean. The very second the American warships crossed the invisible threshold into the strait, the atmosphere turned electric. They were immediately shadowed, hunted, and tracked by aggressive swarm units of the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy. The silence of the radio waves was shattered by an open, brazen challenge from the Iranians. "This is your final warning," echoed through the command centers of the American ships. It was a moment where a single miscalculation could ignite World War III, but the United States Navy does not back down. The American fleet proceeded relentlessly along its plotted route, broadcasting a chillingly calm response that they were operating entirely within the bounds of international law and ceasefire protocols. And then, at the absolute climax of this unbearable tension, the sky ignited. An Iranian directed attack drone, buzzing too close to the American steel wall, was reportedly blown out of the sky by US forces. In a fraction of a second, a piece of hostile Iranian hardware was vaporized, sending a crystal-clear message to Tehran. Even though the Iranian regime desperately tried to save face, officially denying the transit and falsely claiming the American ships turned back in fear, they simultaneously screamed to the international community that they would unleash hell on any foreign military units daring to enter the strait from now on. But to understand the sheer magnitude of this military showdown, you have to look at the explosive political clock ticking in the background. The timing of this action-packed cinematic encounter in Hormuz is no coincidence. It comes immediately on the heels of exactly 21 agonizing hours of high-level diplomatic talks in Pakistan. Talks that collapsed entirely, talks that ended with zero definitive agreement, and the fallout in Washington was instantaneous. Vice President J.D. Vance stepped up to the microphone and delivered a cold, calculated warning, accusing Iran of making a historically massive mistake. That statement was not just political theater, it was the smoke before the fire. It gave the entire world a terrifying glimpse into the war rooms of Washington. The United States is no longer playing the waiting game. Washington is preparing to make its final devastating move on the global chessboard, using an armada of warships and autonomous underwater drones to shatter the locks on Hormuz once and for all. However, beneath the hulls of these billion-dollar American warships, beneath the massive supertankers trying to navigate the channel, lies a nightmare that is entirely invisible to the naked eye, an insidious silent killer waiting in the pitch-black depths. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has seeded the strait with rogue naval mines, and the most terrifying part? Iran laid them so quickly, so haphazardly, using small, fast attack speedboats in the dead of night, that even Tehran no longer knows where they are. These silent killers were caught in the incredibly violent, unpredictable bottom currents of the Persian Gulf. They have drifted miles away from their original drop zones. We are talking about a deadly cocktail of explosives. Moored contact mines waiting for a hull to scrape against them, advanced magnetic and acoustic triggered mines that listen for the specific engine hum of an American destroyer or a commercial supertanker, and drifting mines that bob aimlessly in the waves, creating an invisible lethal labyrinth in one of the most critical waterways on Earth. Iran has birthed a monster and they have completely lost the leash. The underwater landscape is in a state of absolute unpredictable chaos. Yet the fact that two heavily armed Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers, the USS Frank E. Peterson Jr. and the USS Michael Murphy, bravely navigated this watery minefield and emerged unscathed proves that American naval supremacy is still the ultimate guarantor of global stability. The Pentagon did not choose these two specific ships by pulling names out of a hat. These are not just boats. They are floating, impenetrable fortresses equipped with the legendary Aegis combat system. Their radar networks are capable of scanning, identifying, and locking onto threats hundreds of miles away in every possible direction. They were not sent into the strait simply to sweep for mines. They were sent to project absolute, undeniable American dominance. Their mission was to carve out a new, sanitized, safe transit route right through the heart of the danger zone, preparing a heavily armored corridor that will soon escort the merchant ships the world so desperately relies on. And the presence of these American titans is already shifting the tectonic plates of the region. Under the watchful guns of the U.S. Navy, 3 massive supertankers became the very first vessels to successfully brave the strait following the ceasefire process, gliding like ghosts through the most dangerous waters on the planet. The rusted, archaic locks of the global oil trade are finally being forced open by American might. But for the global economy to actually breathe again, Hormuz cannot just be partially open. It must be sanitized. It must be brought back to a condition entirely safe for international maritime logistics. And the heavy lifting for this monumental task will not be done by human hands. It will be executed by a phantom fleet of high-tech unmanned underwater vehicles. Autonomous drones like the lethal knifefish will be deployed into the crushing depths in the coming days. They will hunt the dark waters using advanced sonar to seek and destroy the Iranian explosives. The ultimate question is, where does this escalate from here? Will Washington's striking plans result in a perfectly clear, narrow corridor where oil ships can sprint through in 7 hours? Or is something much more severe on the horizon? President Donald Trump has shattered the diplomatic doublespeak and laid out a chilling, razor-sharp ultimatum. With the kind of raw, unfiltered language that makes foreign capitals freeze, Trump declared, "We will open that strait even if we don't use it because we didn't get help from NATO and the world." Let those words sink in. Trump has broadcasted to the entire planet that the United States of America is fully prepared to use unilateral, devastating military force. The primary move is not just about sending a few drones and destroyers. The real move is a brand new aggressive doctrine that has caught even the most hardline clerics in Iran completely off guard. A doctrine that will lock down the entire Middle East and flip the geopolitical chessboard upside down. In the immediate aftermath of the collapsed talks, Trump signaled this new paradigm via his social media, and the defense community is already calling it the Blockade. If Iran refuses to cooperate, if they refuse to help clean up the explosive mess they created and lost control over, the United States Navy is prepared to establish its own total blockade. This is a monumental shift. It is no longer about just keeping a single lane open for trade. It means bringing every single entrance and exit of the Strait of Hormuz under the direct, undisputed control of the American military. The U.S. plans to establish a chokehold where it completely zeroes out Iran's sovereignty over the water. The American Navy will personally decide which ship passes, which ship stops, and which ship turns around. This scenario has violently outgrown a simple bilateral dispute between Washington and Tehran. The Strait of Hormuz is the beating heart of the modern world. Roughly 20% of the entire global oil supply must pass through this 21-mile-wide artery every single day. If this artery clogs, or if the battle for its control erupts into a full-scale shooting war, the shockwave will instantly trigger a catastrophic energy crisis that will bring Europe and Asia to their knees. Europe's industrial base is already staggering, already fragile from years of economic strain. A shockwave from a closed Hormuz would shatter it completely, factories would go dark, supply chains would disintegrate. But how will Trump's ruthless outblockade actually take shape on the open water? Look to the United States Fifth Fleet, currently sitting on a hair-trigger alert in the region. The Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group, the very armada that the USS Frank Peterson Jr. belongs to, possesses enough raw firepower to erase the coastline of the Persian Gulf. If the embers of war flare up again, the deck of that nuclear-powered aircraft carrier will become a hive of lethal activity. F-35 Lightning stealth fighters and F-A-18 Super Hornets will catapult into the sky, establishing an absolute impenetrable umbrella of American air dominance over the entire strait. Nothing will fly without American permission. Down on the surface of the sea, Ticonderoga-class cruisers and Arleigh Burke destroyers will form a literal wall of steel, physically barricading the entrance to the waterway. The first phase of this surgical military operation is already on the war room tables. The U.S. will attempt to carve open a safe lane in the narrowest, most critical 21-mile stretch of the strait. Lethal, autonomous knifefish drones and advanced mine warfare assets will silently glide through the black waters, neutralizing the Iranian threat, building an invisible, sanitized highway for the world's supertankers. If this initial surgical strike succeeds, massive convoys of tankers will advance under the terrifying shadow of the Abraham Lincoln Strike Group, and global traffic could potentially recover by 40%. But what if Tehran refuses to yield? What if Iran's uncompromising, suicidal arrogance continues? That is when the out-blockade surfaces in all of its terrifying ruthlessness. Imagine the sky torn apart by the roar of P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft hunting for Iranian submarines and fast boats. Imagine additional destroyers and cruisers flooding into the region, turning the waters of Hormuz into heavily militarized, insurmountable American checkpoints. At a moment's notice, the US Navy will execute a lockdown mechanism capable of choking the life out of the Iranian regime, effectively severing 70% of Iran's daily oil exports. American sailors will board, search, and completely block any vessel deemed suspicious. Iran's economy will be suffocated. If the shadows over the Middle East grow even darker and Iran fully violates the ceasefire by May, launching unprovoked attacks, Washington will not carry this burden alone. The United States will transform the Persian Gulf into the nerve center of a massive, heavily armed international coalition. Working from the logistical fortress bases of the allied Gulf states, the US will pull in heavy hitters from around the globe. The British Royal Navy will send the RFA Cardigan Bay. The French will deploy their tripartite-class mine hunters. The Italians will rush their Gaeta-class ships to the front line. NATO's standing mine countermeasures groups will flood into the apocalyptic scene, supported by devastating invisible cyber operations targeting Iranian command and control networks. An unbroken ironclad ring of air and sea patrols will lock the region down. Europe has tried to play the diplomatic game, claiming they will only send ships once the war is completely over. But Trump's relentless pressure, combined with the freezing reality of an energy-starved European continent, will force the EU to abandon its cowardice and join the American vanguard. This entire powder keg comes down to two outcomes. Either the autonomous American drones patiently carve out a safe corridor to let the global economy breathe, or the rogue Iranian mines dragging in the dark currents will ignite a regional ring of fire that can never be extinguished. And the risks facing the American men and women in uniform are profoundly lethal. Iran has spent decades preparing for this exact asymmetric war. They possess thousands of suicide drones. They have hundreds of anti-ship ballistic missiles hidden in mountain bunkers along the jagged coastline. Their entire military doctrine is built upon swarming and sinking massive multi-billion-dollar American warships in the claustrophobic shallow waters of the Gulf, 21 miles wide. At its narrowest point, Hormuz is practically ground zero for modern hypersonic and ballistic missiles. When an American destroyer sails through this gauntlet to enforce Trump's blockade, the crew will have mere seconds to detect, track, and destroy sudden massive missile salvos screaming in from the Iranian shore. The horrifying possibility of an American warship taking a direct hit or being crippled by a remote-controlled explosive boat would instantly transform this localized crisis into a global apocalyptic war. The regime in Tehran, by refusing to negotiate, is screaming to the world that they are willing to burn their own country to the ground. When you are sitting at a table negotiating the survival of your regime, the restriction of your nuclear weapons program, and the crushing weight of economic sanctions, the only physical ruthless trump card you hold is the Strait of Hormuz. The Ayatollahs know that if they surrender the strait, they pave the road to their own destruction. But their desperate gamble is sending shockwaves that are shattering global markets. Oil has violently skyrocketed past $108 a barrel, and the chart is pointing straight up. Maritime insurance premiums have multiplied to astronomical levels. Ship owners are being forced to pay exorbitant mine risk premiums, and the vast majority of tanker captains are flat out refusing to sail into the kill zone. Global supply chains, still recovering from recent years of chaos, are buckling under the pressure. But the devastation goes far deeper than the price of gas in Europe or America. The closing of Hormuz is dragging the entire Asian continent into the abyss. China, Japan, South Korea, India. The economic engines of the Eastern Hemisphere are entirely addicted to the oil that flows through this very strait. When Hormuz clogs, the heart of Asian industry stops beating. Massive manufacturing hubs in China are forced to throttle down. High-tech refineries in Japan are burning through their strategic reserves at a terrifying pace. The backbone of South Korea's petrochemical sector is desperately scrambling for alternative sources that simply do not exist in the volumes they need. Europe's vital liquefied natural gas and crude oil supply lines are severed, and the alternatives, they are a logistical nightmare. Rerouting massive tankers completely around the African continent via the Cape of Good Hope adds 10 to 14 days of travel time and doubles the cost of fuel. The Suez Canal is entirely maxed out, pushed to the absolute limit of its capacity, and is a shooting gallery itself thanks to Iranian-backed Houthi terrorists firing anti-ship missiles from Yemen. This crisis is not just an oil crisis, it is an everything crisis. Natural gas, petrochemicals, agricultural fertilizers, and the raw plastic materials needed for modern civilization all flow through Hormuz. When the strait closes, inflation doesn't just rise, it explodes. The cost of food skyrockets. The cost of electronics, construction materials, and basic consumer goods surges. Developing nations that depend on imported energy are instantly pushed into catastrophic, inescapable debt spirals. And considering that clearing the Strait of Iran's rogue mines will take months, even by the most wildly optimistic military estimates, this massive gaping wound in the global economy will continue to bleed out. But here's where the story takes a turn into pure poetic irony. Iran's brilliant master plan to hold the world hostage has become a noose around its own neck. By mining Hormuz, Iran has blockaded its own economy. Their own exports are trapped. Their own rogue explosives are holding their own revenue hostage. Before this madness, Iran was exporting roughly 1.5 million barrels of crude oil every single day. Today, because of their own reckless military blunders, they cannot move a fraction of that. Furthermore, the clogging of Hormuz has permanently traumatized the global energy market. The entire world has suddenly woken up to the terrifying reality of relying on a single 21-mile choke point controlled by a radical regime. In absolute panic, nations are pouring billions into alternative energy infrastructures and entirely new overland supply routes. Yes, it hurts the global economy now, but in the long run, it completely neutralizes Iran. The longer Tehran keeps the waters dangerous, the faster the rest of the world moves on without them. Iran's ultimate weapon is suffering a massive boomerang effect, rendering their only geopolitical trump card utterly worthless. If the trap you lay for your enemy ends up starving your own people, it is not a military strategy, it is national suicide. Yet in the shadows of this Iranian self-destruction, a much darker, much more dangerous player is watching with a cold, calculated smile. While the world burns, while the United States risks the lives of its sailors, and while Iran bankrupts itself, the Russian Federation is winning. Vladimir Putin is watching the chaos in the Persian Gulf and treating it like a geopolitical winning lottery ticket. Crushed under the weight of severe Western economic sanctions, and having spent billions secretly assembling a ghost fleet to smuggle their oil, Russia is now experiencing a financial golden age precisely because of the chaos in Hormuz. With global oil prices blasting past $108 a barrel in sheer panic, the price caps that the United States and Europe slapped on Russian crude have been blown completely out of the water. Desperate Asian and European markets, starving for energy to keep their factories from dying, are being forced to turn a blind eye to the sanctions. They are buying Russian oil out of pure unavoidable necessity. Billions of dollars of fresh hot cash are flooding directly into the Kremlin's war chests, instantly financing the Russian military-industrial complex and fueling their war machine in Ukraine. But the Russian victory runs much deeper than a temporary spike in the price of crude. The terrifying unreliability of the Strait of Hormuz is acting as a massive advertisement for Russia's ultimate geographic weapon, the Northern Sea Route. For years, Moscow has poured trillions of rubles into developing this icy corridor along the Arctic coast, building the world's only fleet of massive nuclear-powered icebreakers. Now, with the Middle East locked in a chaotic web of suicide drones and drifting naval mines, the Northern Sea Route suddenly looks incredibly appealing. It is an uninterrupted, completely secure transit line connecting Asian manufacturing to European markets, bypassing the Middle East entirely. If global shipping companies are forced to adopt this route, Moscow will hold the keys to the new global trade artery, reaping unfathomable billions in transit fees and toll rates. Putin is weaponizing the ice, entirely funded by the fear generated in the burning sands of the Middle East. And right alongside Russia stands the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing. Both of these massive rival superpowers are using the Hormuz crisis as the ultimate intelligence-gathering opportunity. They are sitting back, watching the United States Navy deploy its most advanced carrier strike groups, its top-tier destroyers, and its highly classified underwater drones. They are measuring American response times. They are evaluating how the Aegis combat system tracks asymmetric drone swarms. Most dangerously, they are watching how effectively the United States military can be stretched across the globe. By forcing the Pentagon to dedicate immense naval and air assets to babysit a 21-mile strait in the Persian Gulf, the United States is forced to draw deterrence away from the Indo-Pacific and Eastern Europe. A massive deployment in the Middle East leaves Washington with less room to maneuver if a crisis suddenly erupts over Taiwan or the Baltics. When you step back and look at the horrifying massive scale of this geopolitical chessboard, the truth becomes terrifyingly clear. Iran's suicidal strategy, which they genuinely believed would be their grand asymmetric victory against the great American Satan, is nothing more than a pawn's move in a much larger, much darker game. Tehran thinks they are defying Washington, but in reality, they are slitting their own economic throat while willingly acting as a tool to enrich and empower Moscow and Beijing. Iran is locking itself inside a burning house while Russia and China watch from a safe distance, warming their hands by the fire. This is exactly why the United States cannot afford to fail. This is why the terrifying, overwhelming power of the American military must force the Strait of Hormuz open. The support of the European Union, the cooperation of the Gulf states, and the absolute unyielding resolve of the American administration are the only things standing between global stability and absolute chaos. The sea lanes must be sanitized. The global economy must be secured. The drifting, invisible killers lurking beneath the waves must be hunted down and destroyed by American technology. If this surgical, high-stakes operation succeeds, the rusted locks of global trade will shatter, the world will breathe a massive sigh of relief, and American hegemony will be proven once again. But if it fails, or if a single American ship is struck in the dark, the resulting explosion will drag the entire world into an inescapable, devastating ring of fire. The stakes have never been higher, the water has never been more dangerous, and the eyes of the entire world are locked on the United States Navy.